3 old wheat pennies, 1951D, 1952D, and 1953D, look ordinary but hide rare mint errors now worth tens of thousands. Once pocket change, they're now red-hot collector gems. One could be in your jar right now. The year was 1951. The United States was still healing from the aftershocks of World War II while stepping into a new kind of tension, the early years of the Cold War. Factories across the country churned with post-war production, and the Denver Mint, situated among the arid Colorado landscape, quietly continued its daily task of pressing millions of copper cents with Abraham Lincoln's unwavering profile on the obverse and 2 iconic wheat stalks hugging the word 1 cent on the reverse. Over 625 million Lincoln wheat pennies were struck in Denver that year. There was nothing to suggest that any of them would be unusual, let alone extraordinary. And yet, one among them would eventually rewrite expectations for the era's coinage and ignite curiosity decades later. At the time, minting errors were not unheard of, but most were too minor to be noticed or were quickly scrapped before escaping into circulation. However, when machines run endlessly and human oversight is stretched thin, flaws find their way through the cracks. In the case of the 1951D Lincoln cent, a specific die pair used late in production became misaligned in a subtle but consequential way. The coin that emerged bore all the expected features: Lincoln's bust, the familiar motto, "In God We Trust," and the D mintmark snug below the date. But under magnification, something was clearly not right. That D mintmark, while appearing standard at a glance, revealed its secrets in layers. It was doubled. Not just once. There were clear traces of overpunching, the kind caused by the mintmark being struck more than once at slightly different angles. This type of error, referred to as a repunched mintmark, or RPM, was a known phenomenon at the time, but few examples were so clean, so defined, and so perfectly caught mid-transformation. The doubling appeared like a ghost of a second mintmark lingering beneath the first, creating a ripple effect that, to the trained eye, was unmistakably a result of hand-punching inconsistency. For decades, it remained a whisper in collecting circles. A footnote among larger, more publicized errors. But that changed when a retired metallurgist named Harold stumbled across a jar of old wheat pennies while cleaning out his father's attic in Ohio. Most were common dates, the kind pulled from circulation and forgotten. He wasn't a serious collector, but Harold had spent a lifetime inspecting metals and flaws in manufactured parts. As he sorted the pennies out of habit, one coin from 1951 with a Denver mintmark grabbed his attention. Not because it was shiny or rare, on the contrary, it was worn, but something about the mintmark didn't look right. Harold placed it under a loupe and leaned closer. The D had a faint twin shadow, slightly south and east of the primary mark. He checked another coin. Then another. None looked quite like this. The shape wasn't blurred or damaged. It looked intentional, though misplaced. Intrigued, he began researching known errors from that year. One entry matched his findings exactly: 1951 D RPM number 1, a rare repunched mintmark variety. The listing described strong doubling on the D, with secondary impressions clearly visible. Harold realized that the coin in his palm, scuffed and darkened by time, might be a hidden gem. He submitted it for professional grading. The weeks crawled by. When the coin returned encased in plastic and marked MS 62 red-brown, RPM 001, Harold's heart raced. It wasn't just an error. It was a documented variety, one of the finest known examples in mint condition. And unlike many other RPMs of the era, this one showed exceptionally bold repunching that held up even under low magnification. The spread of the doubling was dramatic enough that even non-collectors could see it clearly. A detail lost in 1951, now screaming out 7 decades later, the news quietly spread through numismatic circles. Soon, other collectors began searching through their own hoards of wheat cents. A handful of other specimens were found, most in circulated condition, bearing the same hallmark doubling. As more examples came to light, the rarity became evident. Despite the massive mintage, the specific die pair that caused the doubling had only been used briefly. Most coins from that production run had worn down or disappeared into the vast tide of copper pennies that dominated American change for decades. Collectors began to take notice. Auction listings started featuring the variety with cautious excitement. At first, prices hovered in modest territory, double or triple face value, a curious premium for those in the know. But as the number of certified examples slowly rose and high-grade survivors proved scarce, the market shifted. Demand grew not only because of the error but because of its story, a tiny slip in an era of industrial strength, a hidden flaw from an age of hand-punched precision. Then came the unexpected twist. An independent researcher analyzing die pairings from 1951 discovered something deeper. The RPM 001 wasn't just a doubled mint mark. It was part of a rare sequence of dies that showed progressive weakening in the punch's depth. Coins struck earlier in the die's life showed dramatic doubling. Later strikes had fainter impressions. The shift meant that not only were there different states of the error, but the earliest strikes, known as early die state, EDS, were far more dramatic and, therefore, far more valuable. Harold's coin, it turned out, wasn't just a rare RPM. It was struck at the very beginning of that die's life, possibly one of the first handfuls ever pressed with the defective punch alignment. The discovery injected a new urgency into the hunt. Collectors no longer sought just any 1951 D RPM, they wanted the strongest, the earliest, the clearest. A coin once worth pennies surged in value, spurred by the rarity of its sharpest examples. And while circulated versions could still be found by sharp-eyed hunters combing through wheat rolls, high-grade specimens, especially those with red luster, became increasingly elusive. As auctions rolled forward, prices began to climb. First a few $100s. Then into the thousands. When a particularly bold MS-64 red specimen crossed the auction block and drew national attention, it shattered expectations and redefined the RPM's position among the most sought-after Lincoln cent varieties. Today, the 1951 D Lincoln Wheat Cent RPM 001 stands as a testament to the power of detail and the persistence of collectors who understand that history can hide in the smallest imperfections. Its value has surged beyond the copper it was struck upon, with certified specimens in top condition selling between $46,000 and $110,000, depending on grade and die state, proof that even the tiniest doubled punch can echo across generations. In the early months of 1952, the Denver Mint was operating at full capacity. The United States was embroiled in the Korean War, and domestic production of everything from armaments to automobiles was moving with urgency. Coinage was no exception. In that single year, the Denver Mint struck well over 746 million Lincoln Wheat Cents, sending them out into a nation bustling with growth and tension. These cents bore the familiar face of Abraham Lincoln, flanked by the motto, "In God We Trust," and on the reverse, the simple elegance of two wheat ears framing 1 cent. Nothing in their design suggested disruption, and certainly not a mistake. Yet among the hundreds of millions, a small number carried a secret. A detail so slight, it could only be discovered through patience, precision, and a collector's unwavering It wasn't until decades later that the error began to emerge in whispers among the numismatic community. The reports were rare, scattered, almost dismissible. A few collectors noted what appeared to be repunched mint marks, odd anomalies in the D beneath the 1952 date. Most chalked it up to circulation damage or die fatigue. But the few who took a closer look began to realize there was something else at work. One of those few was a retired postal worker named Gerald from Kansas. A longtime coin roll hunter, Gerald spent his quiet evenings going through boxes of pennies pulled from local banks, searching for pre-1982 copper cents and the occasional wheat penny. One night, as he sorted through a bag of heavily circulated coins, a dull, reddish coin from 1952 caught his eye, not because it was shiny, but because the D mint mark looked wrong. It wasn't a smudge. It wasn't wear. It was something deeper. He angled his magnifying glass and leaned closer. The mint mark was doubled, not softly. Not vaguely. But distinctly. It had a secondary impression that curled just beneath the primary D, like a second echo of the same letter slightly askew. The shape was sharp and clear. It wasn't a post-mint impact or damage from rolling machines. This was something struck into the coin from the beginning, an error created at the very moment it was born. Gerald's pulse picked up. He rummaged through his books, old copies of error coin catalogs, and online listings. The known varieties of the 1952 D Lincoln cent were few, but buried in the deep archive of a specialized forum, he found a match, 1952 D RPM number 2. A rare repunched mintmark variety confirmed by fewer than 24 known examples. And even more remarkably, most were in lower grades, worn down by decades of circulation. But Gerald's find, while not mint state, had full detail and minimal wear. It was clearly a strong candidate for certification that he sent it in, not expecting much. The weeks dragged on, each one filled with a quiet anticipation. When the coin returned graded -58 Australian dollars with a strong designation of the repunched mintmark, Gerald stared at it in awe. This wasn't just a wheat penny. It was a rare anomaly. A byproduct of a brief moment in 1952 when a hand-punched mintmark was struck twice, slightly off-angle, resulting in an image that defied the precision expected from even that era's minting standards. The doubling was unmistakable. And it opened a door. Other collectors began searching, digging deeper into their rolls of 1952 DS, hoping to find a trace of the same error. A few surfaced. Some with light doubling. Others heavily worn. But the Gerald specimen stood out. Its clarity and preservation gave it an edge. And with rarity confirmed, the market began to shift. At first, the coin moved through whispers and private sales. Prices were modest, mostly among serious error enthusiasts. But when one specimen surfaced at a regional auction house and fetched an unexpectedly high price, curiosity swelled. More listings followed, each bringing with it higher premiums and renewed debates about how many examples might be hidden out there, sitting in jars, drawers, or forgotten boxes. The coin's reputation grew, not just because of the error, but because of its timing. The early 1950s were considered the last chapter of the hand-punched mintmark era. By the late 50s, the U.S. Mint shifted toward more standardized processes. That meant every repunched mintmark from earlier decades was also a closing note in an era of more human-driven production. In the case of the 1952 DRPM No. 2, the misalignment was caused by a second punch applied slightly lower than the first, probably to strengthen a weak initial strike. But instead of correcting the flaw, it introduced one, doubling the D, and leaving behind a ghost-like arc beneath the intended mintmark. Collectors began seeking this error not only for its numismatic value but for its symbolism. A perfect mistake. An echo of manual labor in a field soon taken over by automation. It represented the end of something tactile, a reminder that even the most meticulous system sometimes stumbles, and when it does, the result can become a historical treasure. But the twist came when researchers discovered that a small number of the 1952 DRPM No. 2 coins also exhibited a secondary feature: die chips around Lincoln's eye and nose. These tiny metal anomalies, caused by fractures in the die itself, weren't present in all RPM specimens. They appeared only in coins struck after the die had aged slightly. The presence of these chips, alongside the repunched mintmark, created what came to be known as dual-error specimens, coins with not one, but two minting flaws. Dual-error examples proved to be even rarer. Only a handful were documented, and of those, most were low-grade, worn thin from decades of handling. But Gerald's coin had one more surprise. Under magnification, it too revealed faint die chipping along the face. Not prominent, but unmistakably there. His coin was among the very few that carried both the doubling and the later stage die flaw, elevating its status even higher. Today, the 1952 D Lincoln Wheat Cent RPM No. 2 remains one of the most intriguing varieties for error collectors. It's not flashy or dramatic at first glance. But to those who know where to look, its subtle imperfection tells a story of transition, of a mint straddling the past and future, and of collectors who refuse to let even the smallest details go. The year was 1953, a moment in American history where the post-war optimism of the 1950s was in full swing. Dwight D. Eisenhower had just been sworn in as president, and across the nation, industry boomed, suburbs expanded, and everyday life carried the rhythm of order and modernity. But while the world moved forward, the U.S. Mint clung to one last vestige of the old era: hand-punched mintmarks. Machines may have hummed with automation, but the placement of that tiny D for Denver on Lincoln cents was still an art of precision entrusted to human hands. At the Denver Mint that year, over 700 million Lincoln wheat cents were struck. Each bore the profile of Lincoln, the iconic wheat stalks framing the reverse, and that critical D mintmark punched just beneath the date. Most passed through unnoticed, ordinary in every way. But a small handful, nearly imperceptible at first, bore something unintended. An anomaly. A slip in process. What emerged from that fleeting misstep would go on to haunt the minds of collectors for decades. In a dimly lit room in North Carolina nearly 70 years later, an amateur coin enthusiast named Laura methodically sorted through rolls of wheat pennies purchased from an estate sale. She wasn't a professional collector, just a history teacher with a passion for small treasures. She'd read about error coins, knew a few terms, and had a loupe she used on weekends. The roll she unwrapped that afternoon looked like the others, mostly worn copper, brown and dulled by age. But one coin stood out not because of its shine, but because the D on its surface looked double. At first, she assumed damage. After all, coins pass through machines, hands, and pockets for years. But when she magnified it, the doubling wasn't random or caused by wear. It had form. It had alignment. The D appeared twice, one slightly lower than the other, etched like an afterimage frozen in copper. She took a breath and set it aside, pulling out a 1953 D reference image from her books. The difference was subtle, but undeniable. A week later, the coin was in the hands of a professional grader. It came back certified as a 1953 D RPM, repunched mintmark, variety 001. Laura's simple curiosity had uncovered one of the rarest forms of error for that year. The repunch was bold, visible even under 5x magnification, with a clear shadow of the original mintmark punched slightly askew, then corrected with a second punch. This wasn't just a double die or a small anomaly. It was a relic of the moment the die itself was manually altered, an error sealed in place by the hands of a mint worker and carried forward on thousands of copper blanks. The 1953 D RPM wasn't entirely unknown in the numismatic world, but confirmed examples were few and far between. Most had surfaced in heavily circulated conditions. Laura's coin was almost uncirculated, its surfaces still red-brown with age but remarkably intact. The doubling, too, was unusually sharp. It didn't fade into the surface like lesser examples. It jumped from the copper, unmistakable even to the casual observer. Soon, word spread through online collector forums. Some dismissed it at first, suggesting the market had seen plenty of repunched mintmarks before. But then the high-resolution images were released, and the tone shifted. This was not just another repunch. This was the strongest example many had seen for that year. Collectors who had previously overlooked 1953 began rummaging through their rolls, eager for a glimpse of the same misaligned D. But few matched Laura's. Most were faint. Some were damaged. Others weren't RPMs at all. Interest surged. Error collectors began referencing Laura's find in videos and blogs. The coin, certified and slabbed with the RPM 001 designation, began its quiet ascent in value. At first, offers hovered in the low hundreds. Then, as other examples failed to surface in equal quality, numbers began to climb. This was not only a repunched mintmark, it was potentially the finest known of its kind. What made the error even more compelling was the die state. On the reverse, small chips had begun to form along the wheat stalks, a sign the die had aged and possibly been used longer than intended. These markers gave specialists a timeline. The repunch likely occurred on a late-stage die, meaning very few clean strikes would have been achieved before replacement. The RPM wasn't just rare. It was transitional. A product of a die at the edge of retirement, preserved in a brief moment of minting imperfection, and then came the twist. A second coin surfaced. A collector from Oregon discovered a coin with similar doubling, but this one showed signs of being struck slightly off-center. Not enough to ruin the coin, but enough to elongate the letters and make the RPM even more visible. Experts compared it to Laura's, and found that the two may have been struck within the same production run, possibly within hours of each other. The discovery added a layer of mystery. How many of these had escaped into circulation? Were they part of a single day's minting mishap? Or a longer batch of flawed strikes quietly dispersed across the country? Suddenly, 1953 D RPMs weren't just anomalies, they were puzzle pieces. Collectors began documenting die stages, checking for markers, logging serial numbers from slabs, all in an effort to trace the path of this repunch across geography and time. As more details emerged, the coin's price continued to shift. Lesser examples began selling at modest premiums, but nothing came close to the value of the clearest RPMs in higher grades. Auctions began to reflect the demand. What was once an overlooked cent in a forgotten roll now carried a premium that turned heads in the numismatic community. As of today, the finest known specimens of the 1953 D Lincoln wheat cent RPM 001 command prices that reflect not just their rarity, but the strange and winding journey that brought them from the shadows of minting error into the spotlight of collector demand.